Good afternoon, everyone. The clock is at 12:01, so I think we are officially at the afternoon period. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming today and helping us honor so many patients who have lost their lives to HIV/AIDS, but also to celebrate the incredible work that our organization does in moving to action, in thinking about prevention, and in treating HIV and related disorders. Thank you to all of you who inspire hope, part of the theme of this meeting, through discoveries that help those who are vulnerable to and live with HIV/AIDS, and the impact that we're having on creating tools to target and control this pandemic. The Fred Hutch is a wonderful place. We're a nucleating influence worldwide around prevention and treatment of HIV/AIDS, and we have a wonderful interface between all of our departments and divisions to help support these efforts, led by the flagship, the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Division that's led by Julie Mcelrath, but also investigators from the Clinical Research Division, Public Health Sciences Division, Human Biology Division, support from the administrative infrastructure, such as our communications group here at the Hutch. And the point is really that it's not whether we're laboratory-based or clinically based or administratively based, but we are all working together to pull the oars in the same direction towards the goals that we have around helping patients who have HIV and including those who have cancer associated with their disease. Today's a very special day for us at the Hutch. December 1st, we're able to welcome Dr. Tom Ulrich, who's joining us. This is his actual first day. Yeah, we are going to put him. He's actually already been at work, so I like that work ethic. We're fortunate to have recruited him from the National Cancer Institute. He'll be an associate member and a clinical scholar in the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Division, but he will also be the deputy head of the Global Oncology Program. And he'll help us with our international translational efforts, our population-based health efforts, not only in Kampala, Uganda, but also in South Africa and in China. He's a medical oncologist by training. He has a special interest in HIV-associated malignancies, which, as you may know, is now the most common cause of death from HIV in the United States, rather than infection. It's a really interesting transition, and that's something I think we can expect worldwide to the extent that we're able to treat HIV infection with antiretrovirals. So he's been very active in that space and has a particular interest and focus on Kaposi sarcoma. He also has worked closely with the HIV or AIDS-associated malignancy consortium, and he's worked with Mac Cheever at the CITN. So we're really delighted to have Tom here today, and it's great that he can participate in the panel. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Jim Kublin, who wore his best tie today, I can see, on this occasion, who does an amazing job as the executive director of the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, which is something that we're known for worldwide. And I can only imagine how challenging that job is, Jim, the herding of the cats, but thank you for all that you do there. So I'd like now to turn it over to my colleague, Michael Luella, who will introduce our esteemed group of panelists for this discussion.
Hello and welcome. And I want to shout out to everyone who's watching us on Facebook. I hope you feel like you can contribute as much as the people here in our auditorium. Just write into the comments section there, and we will be monitoring those. So if you have a comment or a question that you want to have asked, please just send it that way through the comments. And that does mean for the rest of you who are here live, we'll be getting to that section here. Today is a very important day and a very sort of traumatic year, full of tragedy. And one of the things that I find inspiring about it, though, is the resistance that has come up in 2017. And that's really come from the community and people bonding together and fighting and resisting what they see as something that's bad. And it reminds me of a time that I lived through and that many of us have lived through, which was the beginning of the HIV epidemic in the 80s. It sort of has a lot of parallels for me, and I hope that we can sort of explore that together. But today is also not just a time to remember about those times, it's a time to sort of celebrate where we've come from, how we got here, and what I really think is important is to realize how fragile where we are is right now. Now is not the time to give up any of the work in terms of research or in terms of community efforts, in terms of ending the HIV epidemic for everyone, everywhere on this earth. We need to continue that. And so, as a sort of exploration of all of that idea, I've pulled together a panel because one of the things that people always ask me when I'm out in the community talking about the work I do here at Fred Hutch in terms of HIV research, they're like, that's a cancer place. What are you doing HIV over in the cancer place? So one of the things that we thought we'd bring up to light here is talking about why we do HIV here at Fred Hutch. And so I have an esteemed panel of guests here for you, and I'm going to introduce them as they speak, and I'm giving them 3 minutes each to kind of tell you a sort of encapsulation of why they work in HIV, why they do that work here at Fred Hutch, and how community can collaborate with the people working here at Fred Hutch in terms of the work that we're doing. So that's just giving you a general idea. Once each of them has gotten a chance to speak, we're going to open it up to you. And before we get to that, if you're like me, when you start talking about HIV, you might start thinking about people that you know who live with HIV, and you might also think about people that you know who have passed. So before we end this hour's observance, we're going to have a chance to say their names, because one thing that I've learned about HIV is that it thrives in silence. And today, I really feel like we have a lot of silence around HIV. People do not say the word HIV nearly enough. And so we're going to at least say the names of people that we want to remember, because as long as their names are said, they're never forgotten. But that'll be at the end. All right, so the first panelist that I would like to introduce is Dr. Julie Mcelrath.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm sure among all of us here, including myself, we've all been touched by HIV at some time, in some way. It's a very personal thing to us. And I think it's so important that we have World AIDS Day to reflect on what this means to us and how it's changed our lives since the epidemic began. So HIV has taken its toll on many lives, and we're here to celebrate that we have fewer people dying and more than half of the world's population being treated. But to me, the most worrisome thing is that we still have new infections every day of every year. And this year in Seattle, over 300 new infections in a place where the word should be getting out. And worldwide, over 1.9 million infections. So it's very clear that if we don't stop new infections, we won't end the epidemic. And so for us, it's not any longer about imagining an end to the epidemic. It's about saying we have ended the epidemic. And if we want to end the epidemic, we have to stop the new infections. And in my view, the way to end new infections is to develop a protective HIV vaccine, because that is effectively the only way to generate long-lived immunity against the virus. So how are we going to do that? So here at Fred Hutch, we have an enormous effort to try to develop an HIV vaccine. Currently, our HIV Vaccine Trials Network has 4 large-scale efficacy studies ongoing. These 2 involve using monoclonal antibodies to provide passive immune prophylaxis, and 2 involve active immunizations to induce potentially long-lived immunity. In addition, we have a whole host of new ideas, concepts now into first-in-human immunogens that are being tested. And the idea with those, in large part, is to see if we can take the immune response along a journey to developing a broad neutralizing antibody immune response. We're a long way from getting there, but we do ultimately think that might be part of the long-term solution to an effective vaccine. So this work largely is headquartered and emanates from the Hutch. In addition to that, we have a whole cadre of investigators here working on HIV prevention, HIV transmission, HIV pathogenesis, HIV basic discovery of immune design. These are also really important to the work we do here and why we think we will eventually get to the long-term solution. So why do we do this work here at the Hutch? That's the question we were asked to answer. And in my view, we do it here because we can, and we can do it here like nowhere else. Okay? And the reason we can do it here like nowhere else is, number one, because of all of you I'm looking at, because you're part of this. You're doing this. We can do it here because we have the leadership support, we have the administrative support, we have the operational support, we have very bright scientists, we have very bright lab technicians, very bright clinicians, the whole host of people work together. It's cross-cutting. It's not one single individual. It's all of us together here at Fred Hutch that are really leading the way toward the long-term solution. So finally, I'd like to say is that I think we will get here. We will get there. We don't want to imagine it. We want to know it's ending. And let's do this together. And as we're doing this, let's just remember all those whose lives have been touched by HIV, including the loss of people way too soon. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have one of my bosses, Dr. Keith Jerome.
Thank you, Michael. So I did some of my earliest medical training, medical school, during some of the very earliest days of the HIV epidemic. And you don't come through that experience the same person, and those experiences never leave. I remember how scared people were. I remember people dying, people I cared for. And I remember, as one of the doctors in training and the scientists, how little we actually knew about what we were facing at that time. And that was really a major part of why I decided to become a virologist. I wanted to be a virologist, and I'm not making this up. I wanted to do my research here at Fred Hutch. I was on the East Coast, but I wanted to come here. And a lot of years later, I'm more convinced than ever that was the right decision. I was drawn here because of the strength of the science and the scientists. They were sort of my heroes at the time. I wanted to be one of their peers someday. But now I have the privilege through DefeatHIV, our collaboratory working on an HIV cure, together with Hans-Peter Kiem, my co-leader, to actually bring these folks together now and harness this incredible scientific talent in the search for an HIV cure. So we get to bring together clinicians and basic scientists, people like Julie. We've learned so much from the effort toward an HIV vaccine. The basic scientists are amazing. Some of the things that we work on now, understanding the HIV reservoir or working on gene editing, that would have sounded like science fiction when I was a trainee, and now it's a reality coming toward cure. So I'm incredibly grateful to be here at the Hutch. I'm grateful for the support that we have. I'm grateful for the way that the Hutch supports our collaboration with community in this search for a cure. Our community folks are so involved in what we do. Our research is better. It is absolutely better because of what they provide to us. They keep us grounded. It gives us a sense of urgency. We never forget why we're doing this. And I'm incredibly grateful for everyone we get to work with. So I'm convinced really that Fred Hutch, we together as a group, are going to change the world. I'm convinced there's going to be a cure for HIV. I'm convinced there's going to be a vaccine. And our job is simply to come here every day to the Fred Hutch and make that day a reality. And that keeps me going day to day.
Thank you. And you've already heard the intro to Dr. Thomas Uldrick, so I'll just turn it over to you, Doctor.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks, Michael. So it's an honor to be here for Inspiration and Impact. My medical career basically spans the era of effective antiretroviral therapy. I actually started as a pre-med student. My first exposure to HIV was as a volunteer at Gay Men's Health Crisis in an adherence program in clinical trials for people living with HIV who were enrolling in a new class of drug called protease inhibitors, which were very difficult to take at the time. And over the past 20 years, I've seen effective antiretroviral therapy transform the lives of people with HIV globally. At the same time, cancer has become the leading cause of death for the 35+ million people in the US and globally living with HIV. And indeed, the burden of curable HIV-associated cancers in low and middle income countries, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, is tremendous. As a medical oncologist and hematologist, what drives me to come to work every day is a desire to improve cancer outcomes for people with HIV, which I believe is very doable. Desire to contribute to the basic science and the pathogenesis-based studies of virus-associated cancer so that we can develop the next generation of cures. And really the strong commitment with my virology and immunology colleagues who are working in the field of HIV cure and leveraging the population with HIV and cancer to explore HIV cure endpoints. So those are the things that drive me. I'm really excited to be joining the Hutch today on World AIDS Day. I think that this is a unique institution to work at. I'm honored to work with the large community of HIV researchers in the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Division, to continue work with the Cancer Immunotherapy Trials Network, exploring immunotherapy for patients with HIV and cancer, and really to expand our efforts in the Global Oncology Program to do high-impact transformative research to affect cancer care throughout the world in places like Kampala, Uganda. Throughout my career, one thing that has always humbled me and consistently amazed me is the commitment of clinical trial participants towards advancing the science for others. And this is something that's always moved me. I'm really looking forward to engaging community activists and community advisory boards around the issues of HIV-associated cancers, which I think could be done in a better and more systematic way. And certainly I consider community engagement critical for the Global Oncology Program as we think about ways to address HIV-associated cancers globally. And I do believe we can make a huge impact in this area. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And next, we have a colleague of mine, Brian Minalga, and I'll let him introduce himself and talk to you.
Hungire, inoranjo unochari kandingwa kovitoto, wami umukwauti, badakoneo mara bikarakopuo odhomburambari. So when I was a primary school teacher in Namibia, about a quarter of the children that I taught in school, grades 5, 6, and 7, were considered OVC. Is anybody familiar with that term, OVC? Yeah. You know it? Exactly, yeah. So it's a really common term in Namibia, which means orphans and vulnerable children. And about, well, I would say most of these OVC that I was teaching in school had lost their parents or their caretakers to HIV. So when I think about this question of why do we do this work at the Hutch, I think it's actually written into our mission statement. The mission at the Hutch is dedicated to eliminating cancer and related diseases as causes of human suffering. So I think it's actually written right into our mission statement as to why we do this work at the Hutch. When I think about what the realization of that mission would mean to those children in Namibia, I think it's a really powerful one. So I think our answer is actually right there in our mission statement. But I also think about what the mission would mean to me personally and to me and my communities. One of those OVC, one of the students that I used to teach recently found me on Facebook. He's grown up now. He's looking into going to university. And he found me on Facebook and he saw a picture that I had posted this summer of myself with some friends on the beach. And he said, "Mr. Bryan, are you gay?" And I said, "Yes, extraordinarily so." But it made me think about how these are two very different people from two different corners of the world for whom this mission of eliminating, disease as the cause of human suffering means so much. And, I think in terms of the research, when we look at, the products that we've heard about, vaccine, cure, I think it's really important to remember that the trust and the utility in those products and for those products starts with the research process and with engagement in the research process. So the work that I do now for the Legacy Project is based on community engagement. So my job is to kind of build trust in these research products, be the bridge between the research enterprise and the communities bearing the greatest burden of HIV in the United States. So, when I think about that mission and what it means not only to folks outside the United States, but, right here at home, I think we need to remember that our goal and our endpoints is not just phase 3 clinical trials with high efficacy. It's the utility of these products, of prevention products, of cure, of treatment, that equals the full and healthy lives of African American men who have sex with men, of transgender persons, of indigenous communities, of Latinx folks, of children, girls and boys in sub-Saharan Africa, the same children that I taught and who taught me so much as well. So when I introduced myself in the Himba language, I told you that my name is Unochari, and that's the name that my community in Namibia gave to me. It means he has grace. And I see that name as more of a challenge than a compliment for my community. As in, will he live his life with grace? Will he conduct himself and his life's work with grace? And I would extend that challenge to all of us when we think about the research we do and the community engagement that necessitates the research that is related and tied to the research. And so I'll just end with a story about, kind of getting to the why I do this work. Again, I've already told you some of why, but the story is about the first time I heard about HIV. And my story with HIV doesn't begin in Namibia. It starts in a semi-rural community in Wisconsin, where I grew up. If you can believe it, if you can imagine, I was once a little closeted gay boy in semi-rural Wisconsin. My best friend in Seattle is convinced that I was actually raised by radical lesbians in Manhattan. When in fact I was raised in this, kind of conservative community in Wisconsin, and it was in 7th grade in a health class the first time I heard about HIV. And the health teacher, kind of put up some scary pictures of what this virus can do to people. And he said, HIV, AIDS, this is the disease that's caused by gay people, and this is how gay people die. So you can imagine little closeted gay Brian Minalga in this classroom looking at these scary pictures and thinking, this is my future. When in fact now, that was not the case. Where I am now is here at this institution with this mission to eliminate disease as the cause of human suffering. I am now the educator. I'm now the one who gets to tell people about the truth about HIV, the truth of what is possible. And I think there's a lot of meaning to that. And I think it's tied to our mission of community engagement at the Legacy Project, when people like me get to now stand at these premier institutions and work with these researchers as well. So, Okunene Kuhepa, thank you.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce to you one of the CAB members of our Seattle HIV Vaccine Trials Unit, Katie Kim.
Hi. I gained my interest in HIV first when I was 18, 19. I started volunteer at Bailey Boucher House, and that was for class credit, and that's how it started. There were a lot of options for which community I can do my volunteer work for class credit, and Bailey Boucher House stood out because it was something that somewhere that I haven't been experienced with, that I didn't really know about, and I was complete curiosity. I want to try this, and that's where everything began with my tying to my current work in HIV as well. I met a lot of people who contracted HIV from different transmission routes, and I ended up doing some of the public health work in Tanzania for a few months to explore, what is it like globally? How is HIV affecting the communities in rural village that doesn't have any access to health care unless you drive to like 3-4 hours. So I lived there with people like homestay people. There was no electricity, no running water, and my house mom's husband passed away with AIDS, and there was a kid who contracted HIV, mother to the vertical transmission, and not surprisingly, his status wasn't revealed in the community or among his friends because of the stigma and discrimination that he might experience. So majority of my work was spreading the HIV awareness and perform HIV educational lessons to these people. And there were a lot of misconceptions from the village people, because at first there was no access to any education, there was no access to the health cares, and there wasn't any resources available for people who can support people who got affected with HIV, the family and the individuals. It was surprising to find out that the kid who contracted HIV through vertical transmission, the aunt was purposely trying to reveal his status so she doesn't have to take care of him anymore. It was very surprising, and after I returned to US, I wanted to know more about the virus itself, so I got involved in HIV research and virology level with at the UW with Dr. Mullins, and it's been a great journey. Everything was fascinating, and it was so exciting that I was doing something, I was contributing something to the HIV scientific community. However, there was a missing piece. Sometimes that creeps me when the lab days are long and I'm not getting enough results, or like the results that I want to get. And that's when I joined a Seattle HIV Vaccine Trial Unit community advisory board. That's when every meeting we have, we talk about how to connect with the community, how to improve our participants. It's impressive how diversified the clinical trial participants for HIV had been this past decades. And how do we reach out to the community? Whenever I take Uber or Lyft, they always ask me, what do you do for your life? And I talk about what I do, and they ask me all these questions because they're interested, but they don't really know anything about it. And that's the reality of the public, that there is that something lacking in the scientific communication, that we're here at the Hutch trying to resolve that and trying to bridge the gap. And Seattle is such a grateful place where there's a diverse HIV research is going on, and also a very supportive community. And I think it all centers at the Hutch. That's where we kind of come together, and that's where we brainstorm. And okay, we have these figured out, but how do we incorporate all these and reach out and improve what's the next step, and how can we do that? And that's, now I truly believe that there is still hope, and everyone's working hard on it, yeah.
Thank you. And next I would like to introduce to you Bill Hall, who is one of the CAB members for the CAB that I help run here for Defeat HIV. Bill?
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here to remember those who have passed from AIDS. I've lived with HIV and AIDS for 31 years now, and I have far too many people to remember. And I've been thinking about them all week, and it's really surreal to sit here and say I've lived with this disease for 31 years when it really seems like just yesterday. But I became involved with Defeat HIV because I felt that at the beginning of this disease, there was so much push for a cure. And when meds became available that were really working, it seemed like the search for a cure kind of fell by the wayside. And I received an email from Michael one day talking about Defeat HIV. And he put the word cure in there, and that kind of sparked my interest. And I joined Defeat HIV. And one of the things that I think about is when Michael first posed, I'm sorry, I'm so nervous, I'm shaking. When Michael first posed the question, what would a cure mean to you? It really seemed like an odd question to me because, you know, in my day and age, a cure was a cure. It had, you know, no alternate definitions. And when he asked me to speak here today, I really had to sit down and think really about cure. And I've talked about this many times in the past few times that I've talked. I'm Native American. I'm a Tlingit Indian from Southeast Alaska. And I know of 4 natives who contracted HIV and were so ashamed about being HIV positive and so afraid that they were going to be disowned by their friends and family that they never sought treatment. And because of this, they died. And I think about them a lot. And I think, you know, it really, what they went through. And so when I think about a cure, I think about the people out there who go through this. It's not just the natives. I'm sure there are thousands of people across the country that go through the stigma of being HIV positive and the fears that are well-founded, because our history shows that many people who became HIV positive and were living with AIDS were disowned by their friends and family. So when I think about a cure, I think you're not only going to be curing AIDS, you're going to be curing the stigma that's attached to AIDS. And it just doesn't get any better than that, because I think stigma is really what holds us back from really combating HIV and AIDS. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you all. Gary wanted to say a few final words before we get to our question and answer.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to all the panelists. That was very moving, and I really appreciate hearing your perspectives and insights. And I'd like to come back to a comment that Julie made at the beginning, that HIV has touched all of our lives. And thinking back for me, my best friend from high school died in his college years from AIDS. And when I was an intern a medical student at UCSF at San Francisco General Hospital, Sue Desmond-Hellman, who's now at the Gates, was my intern. And we watched 50% of our admissions at the time were, as we now understand, were HIV related, but this was in the early 1980s, so the term hadn't even been coined at that point. And you'd watch these young men that were my age dying from pneumocystis pneumonia, from all kinds of horrible infectious complications. It's so wonderful to see how far we've come, but I think the panel points out how far we have to go. And to get back to this point about why do we do this here at the Hutch, we do it for a lot of reasons. We do it for some of the reasons that Julie alluded to. We do it because we can. We do it because we've got great people. We attract the best and the brightest talent, some of which are up here on this panel, but all of you in this room come together to do what we can do here at the Hutch to move this forward. But we don't do it just because we can. We do it because we must. This is a moral imperative for us. We need to change the face of this disease across the world, and we have the potential for doing that here with all of you in this room. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for everything that you do, and understand how important this is for the mission of the Hutch. And now Michael has a very cool thing for the question and answer period that we just got this. This is the first time we've tried it out. So have any of you seen these things?
So the microphone is inside this. It's padded. And what we're going to do, take that, is toss it out to you. And you can throw it to each other, so we no longer have to have the running around with the microphone. We can just toss it to there. So do we have anyone out there who wants to ask a question? Or who wants just to hold this? Oh, come on. There has to be someone who has a question. Ready? Okay, here we go.
It's a pillow.
All right. Just a question for, I guess, Brian, maybe to start, and those who are involved in CAB. I'm just wondering what you think is the biggest challenge, or what are some of the biggest challenges in this country in terms of stigma, in terms of acceptability of treatment, acceptability of PrEP, and how stigma and acceptability, what are the challenges and what do we need to do to improve that in the U.S.? I know there's huge issues all over the world, but I think there's a lot of big issues still here, I assume.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And at the Legacy Project, we talk a lot about those issues, and there are many of them. One thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is, what are some examples of tools that we have now that have already gone through the research process that are not reaching the communities that they need to? And I think probably most of us know that PrEP is one of those, oral PrEP. We have Truvada, which it has very high efficacy, has gone through many clinical trials. And here in the United States, where over 80% of HIV incidence is represented among African American men who have sex with men, we see that PrEP is being used by white folks at a rate of 70%. So, there's a disparity not only in terms of overrepresentation in the epidemic among certain populations, but also an underrepresentation of those same populations in the research, and then also underrepresentation of those populations using these products that go through clinical trials. So when I think about the reasons for that, I think you point out stigma as a really important one. And the one, I would say, the main issue that we focus on in my work is mistrust. And the legacy, we have that name, the Legacy Project. What is the legacy of some of the historical atrocities that research has committed? We think about the Tuskegee syphilis trials and the legacy that has left among African American men in this country to this day. So I think, and the same also applies. I have a lot of folks that I work with in the transgender community who we talk about HIV cure with. And we did a webinar last year on HIV cure for women, and there was a transgender woman of color out of Detroit who said, "This is the first time anyone's ever asked me to think about cure, to talk about cure." And I think that's a problem as well, when we have communities that we're not thinking about and not including in the research itself. There's that mistrust that already exists. There's the exclusion from research as well. So I think that's something that we can all do, whether we're community or research or somewhere in between. I think that's something we can do to think about how we can better include communities and better build that trust from the very beginning in the research process, through that inclusion, through demystifying research. I think we talk about research sometimes in ways that is really inaccessible to a lot of communities. So there's a lot of different things we can do to demystify the research, to build that trust, and just to do a better job in terms of research and community engagement.
Anyone else?
As I've mentioned, I think the scientific communication it plays an important role to connect people in general public and also the scientific findings. There are a lot of studies and clinical trials going on with the vaccine studies and other HIV pathogenesis or diversity, latency, so many studies, but it's the general public, especially who are most affected, the communities that are most affected. Like, where do they get all these information? How are they? It's really hard to read the scientific literature from like journals or PubMed. Like, how can we convey these information to the general public solve any misconceptions or let them be more engaged, that something about like term science is not like the scary thing. It's not hard to understand, and that's one thing that we can work on, especially in the developed countries. And when I was in Tanzania doing a lot of HIV education and awareness campaign, there was actually several, few old men who would not just believe any of the things that we talk about. We talked about the origin of HIV all the way to the current scientific stuff. And the men's like, oh, you guys are just some people from US to sent to so you can lure us believe into that it's not harmful. Your HIV vaccine studies, it's just causing even more harms. Him and other folks, they were just disbelief. And I was there for several months, and it was a small village, so we ran into each other like almost every day. And with all the effort, I failed to convince those few people. And that was something that we had to talk about later, like after the program, like how can we move forward and change some people's mindset, and that's something that's very difficult to do. But I still don't know how that can be done, and there's a lot of people in public health research and medical social work trying to overcome that.
All right. Where is the ball? And do we have another person who wants to get the ball? No one. Well, while we find someone, I have a question for you all. So there's still so much that we do not know. And clinical research is a way of knowing things in the world. And so specifically, what areas of HIV do you think are not being addressed that we need to address? And that can be whether it's basic science, or it could be about the social sciences. What do you think is needed besides obviously a vaccine and a cure? I'm taking away the easy ones there. Something else beyond those two. And I'd love to hear everyone. So let's go down that way.
I don't think we have a good way yet, and Keith could argue with me, about how to measure the hidden virus, the latent virus in people who have HIV infection. And in order to really get a good handle on that, it's going to be very hard to know how can we make a dent in it? How can we really wipe out the latent virus? There's still a lot of arguments about what is causing the latency, what is perpetuating it. A lot of good theories, but a lot of people arguing what exactly is governing the mechanism why we still have these latent cells. And so I think that we need to get to the bottom of that in order to be able to effectively work with ways to let it go.
Well, I certainly can't argue with that at all. I think it's a critical question. And that's where a lot of our effort is going right now, frankly, is trying to understand how much virus is there, how much of it is what they call defective, so that it can never actually reactivate and cause a problem, so that we can really focus on the ones that actually pose a risk to people, that make them sick or that can ultimately be transmitted. It's really difficult. But until we get those assays in place, we don't have a great way of measuring how well we're doing. So we're doing trials. We can tell we're having an effect on the virus, but is it meaningful? Is it enough? And how good do we really need to be? And those are all mysteries. And I really agree with Julie. Until we answer those, we're stumbling around in the dark a little bit. And maybe a call out again to folks, community folks and participants in the studies. These are not easy studies to participate in. There's a lot of sampling, and people have given a lot of tissue and blood many times repeatedly. And what a shout out to them for really putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to say we all want to have cure, and we ask a lot of them. So yeah, congratulations to them.
So in the field of cancer, I think the scientific area that really needs a lot of work is better understanding why people get Kaposi sarcoma and why they die of KS. I think there's a lot of assumptions that people get KS because they don't take their HIV medicines, and they die because they don't take their HIV medicines, and I can't tell you how wrong that is. And certainly a better understanding of why people get KS and why they die of KS is critical to better able as a community to address Kaposi sarcoma. I also think we need to start thinking about what it means to have a functional cure for Kaposi sarcoma. That's something that people have not even begun to discuss.
So to expand on a little bit of what I said just before, I think we could do some more research into how do we foster acceptability and desirability in HIV prevention specifically. I don't think we've talked about microbicides yet, but the Microbicide Trials Network is doing some really interesting work around this idea of how do we develop biomedical products that people will actually want to use, people will actually be excited about using. So, you know, products that will fit into the sex lives of people. You know, they're talking about like rectal inserts, about like a lube that might have an antiretroviral medication in it, vaginal rings, which is now, you know, under regulatory review. So I think in terms of the research, looking at that social behavioral side and how that intersects with the biomedical of how do we foster that acceptability and desirability among people to be excited about using HIV prevention products and bring a little sexy back to HIV prevention research.
I do have to talk about HIV latency since I spend a lot of time doing that as in my current work. And the key for a functional cure, like, is where I think we need to know where it's hiding, where in which cells, what tissue, and what location in the body, and which ones are still producing infectious virus, because there are a lot of those are defects that can't infect the new cells, and there had been some of the cancer cell related integration studies, and those found to be defect, a lot of like cancer causing ones, or cancer-like or cancer-associated. And that's where I think is, people say that's the golden thing. We're, like, I think as Julie and Keith will agree, we're trying to find the needle in the haystack in HIV latency studies. And as they mentioned, there is no accurate and fast measurement of the HIV reservoirs. So there is a lot of focus on that, and as well as, okay, like what do we do when we find them? And there have been a lot of hypotheses, these cells or these markers, but I don't think we have found a solid one yet.
I think that as it pertains to my native tribe, I think the thing that holds us back is they never talk about sex. I don't think in my whole life growing up with my family I ever heard anybody mention sex or anything related to sex. And if you talked about it, you were scolded, and not talking about sex is, you know, if you were gay, there was total silence around it. The family kind of knew you were gay, but they didn't want any acknowledgement that you were gay. And I think that's the biggest obstacle we have in that HIV/AIDS is transmitted sexually, that we have to overcome, find some way to open this discussion on why HIV/AIDS matters, especially to our community. And so I think we need to find a global way of talking about diseases that are killing our people.
All right. Well, I think that is where we're going to stop things. But before we all take off, I wanted to sort of remember the people that may have been in your life, that have been in my life, that have been in our lives. They may be famous people that you never really knew, but somehow have touched you. They may be close and dear family members or friends. But they're not really gone, even though they may have died, or their hearts have stopped beating, or they're in the ground, or burned up and let free into the air. As long as we're saying their names, they're still around. I've always heard it said that you die two deaths. The first one is when your heart stops and your body kind of stops. And the second one is when the last person ever says your name. So as long as we keep on saying the names of those people who've passed, they're still here with us, and they still can inspire us to keep on going. And so I wanted to have all of us sort of just say the names of people that you may know, whether they are famous people or maybe someone that's close to you that you know who've passed from HIV, and end on that sort of note. So I would love us all to speak it all at once. So in other words, not going up and down the row saying names, but all together. And if you would all please rise to do it, to sort of honor those who have passed. And say as many names as you want, and you are free to leave whenever you wish. Once you say a name, I'm not going to be checking for that. And you might hear me saying the name Michael a lot, but that's because I know a lot of Michaels. I'm named that way, and there was one time in that life that it seemed like everyone was named Michael. So we will all be saying their names. Let them be remembered. And I will start with Bob Kingston, Will Horswood, Freddie Mercury. I hear no names. Speak them out. Michael. Daniel. Robert. David. Gia. Michael. George. Ravel. Well, thank you very much. May they always be remembered. Keep up the good work. Thank you very much.